Jeremy, nice to meet you. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I've listened to several of your podcast episodes, so excited
Right on.
to hang out with you for a little.
Yeah, I'm stoked to talk to you. You kind of position yourself as a conflict resolution expert, but I love the other, the flip side of that is a peace builder.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they're entirely, opposites. So it'd be fun to talk about that. Like peace building and
Yeah.
conflict resolution are related, but maybe not exactly the same thing. But
Yeah.
before we kind of dig into that and talk about your life, and I know we got a lot of interesting things in common. Martial artist, right? Love to travel. I love that too. I've been a lifetime martial artist. Why don't we start there? Let's talk about your kind of your upbringing. You said you grew up in LA when I was talking to you prior.
Yeah.
And so what were things like for you? What were your family like? What were some of your influences early on in your life?
I grew up in a sort of a nice neighborhood, suburban neighborhood of Los Angeles. Had a kind of a large family. Had three siblings. I was the oldest, and my two parents still together. So good upbringing altogether. My mom kind of led me into martial arts when I was about 10 or 11 years old, and that became a large part of my life.
Yeah.
Throughout my childhood and then throughout my life.
Did you find Hapkido then, or was it one of those like United Martial Arts?
It was it was. I don't even know if they were around yet. USSM or whatever they're called. I started out in, I think it was Tang Sudo, and with just like a teacher who was doing a small thing in a community area or something, like a community building or something. And then I got into Taekwondo in a studio, and then eventually when I was about 13, I found Hapkido, and that's where I stuck until I got my black belt when I was about 20 or 21, I think. So,
yeah.
And then from there,
martial arts for kids, especially if you stick it out to black belt, it's such a powerful and positive kind of instrument, to keep people on track and disciplined, and a positive peer group and a role model in terms of the mentor relationship with the teacher, assuming he's good or she. I didn't find martial arts until I was 21. We didn't have anything in upstate New York where I lived.
Oh, wow.
Back in the 80s, right? There was just nobody up there who was doing it. That's interesting. So what about, what led you to psychology? And what was your college experience like?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think martial arts had a big part of that. So I was for a long time when I was doing martial arts. Then I eventually got into like more sort of when I was an adult, more into like mixed martial arts and sort of practical self-defense, Krav Maga, that kind of thing. And I got really interested in like what some people call verbal self-defense, verbal judo, de-escalation techniques, that sort of thing. I wanted to figure out like, okay, so I kind of know how to defend myself, potentially, physically. Like, how do I de-escalate situations emotionally, mentally? And I got really interested in that. And I started a coaching practice, personal development coaching, after I had been in coaching myself for several years. I started feeling like I could probably figure this out, and I started experimenting with that. So I had a coaching practice, I had a martial arts academy, and then I just thought, I'm going to take the next step in terms of academics and actually go back and start getting some more formal training. When I got a master's in anthropology, I was really interested in evolutionary psychology and the evolution of cooperation and conflict, and that's where I studied in evolutionary anthropology. And then I was interested in conflict specifically, and I wanted to learn some more practical techniques. So I got a master's in conflict resolution and peace building, and then eventually right after that I decided I want to take it to the next level and get my PhD in psychology and really focus on social psychology as it interacts with motivation and performance psychology, because I think a lot of that has to do with conflict. So my goal was, how do I become an expert in the psychology of peace and conflict to help people figure out how to resolve, manage, de-escalate, transform situations without having to get physical, essentially. So it's a nice, for me, it's like a nice tool, nice well-rounded toolkit of let's always try never to go to the physical part. Let's try to keep it at the interpersonal.
Well, actually, you could even go further and say, let's not go to the violent part, which doesn't have to be physical. It could be a lot of violence is perpetrated emotionally, psychologically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Through abusive behavior. I think that's fascinating. And many people might be curious as to the link between, learning how to fight and defend oneself, and then learning how to de-escalate and or use language to diffuse a situation.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of reminded, one of my mentors was an Aikido master. He's a 8th degree black belt in Aikido named Richard Heckler Strozzi.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've heard his name.
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting guy. He was involved in a lot of work with special forces and conflict resolution, also in the Middle East. And he's got a leadership development program where he uses Aikido as a foundation for, conflict resolution, believe it or not, using language. It's very fascinating. It'd be interesting for you guys to hook up. And, I could tell you more about him, but I'm curious, this is really about you, but what were some of your insights from your martial arts training that kind of helped you bridge between, the physical art, the practice art of fighting and defending to, diffusing, conflict verbally and emotionally?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've had this conversation a few times with people. It's interesting. The first time I ever had this conversation was with a fellow. He called himself a peace builder, but he challenged me and basically said, how dare he was very defensive. He said, how dare you call yourself a peace builder or conflict when you've studied martial arts and you've done this violent stuff and you've studied Krav Maga, and that's the tools used by the oppressors against my people and all that stuff. So it challenged me to really be able to try to figure out how to articulate the connection between martial arts and conflict resolution or peace building. In my estimation, I think there's a lot of ways you can go with this conversation, but in my estimation, martial arts, if you're learning from a good teacher, like a lot of these Aikido teachers, it's not about violence, necessarily even physical self-defense always. Really what it's about at the core are some fundamental principles. One of them being, how do you embody or establish for yourself a level of humble confidence where you can really be humble and modest, but also feel confident and grounded and present in your stance or wherever you are. And I feel like that is something that's so translatable to conflict resolution, because when you're doing peace building work, people's emotions will be high, people will get into it with each other. And you really, as a peace builder, one really has to be the one who holds the space. And you have to be humble, but you also have to be confident enough to hold the space so that people can feel safe to explore emotions, to be emotional. I've been in situations where people have been outbursts, crying, etc. And if I don't feel confident in holding that space and making sure that everybody feels safe there, the whole thing's going to go completely off the rails.
Yeah.
So for me, that's the big translation.
I 100% agree. I think that it's worthwhile kind of digging into this a little bit more. So my experience was very similar in that it was my martial arts training that led me to from thinly veiled arrogance to humble confidence, and it took time. And so the martial arts really is a refinement of your character over a long period of time through repeated failures, through repeated painful circumstances where you realize that you're not as good as you thought you were. There's always someone who's got a better skill, better technique, who's more poised in a particular day, who's more present, more whatever, and yet you keep showing up, and you keep getting humbled, and you keep refining, practicing. An integrated practice which includes the body, doesn't leave it behind. So body, mind, emotions, and spirit. Prior to me starting in my martial arts training, I was physically talented. I was intellectually, qualified in a lot of ways. Had a MBA and CPA, and I was getting my black belt here during that time. But I still attracted violence because I was fearful.
Yeah.
I presented well on the outside, but inside, deep down, I still experienced shame and fear and a deep lack of confidence, which I masked over with overachievement and, this kind of like what I now call arrogance.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I learned the SEALs version of Krav Maga, which is called SCARS back then, built off of Sansu Kung Fu. Have you ever heard of Sansu?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I did a little bit of Sansu.
Yeah, so you know what that's like. It's basically... it's like Kung Fu without the Fu.
Right.
It's just stripped down, no holds bars, very, very functional fighting. But once I learned ultimately how to, it sounds harsh to say this, but to actually confidently know how to dissemble a human being, in
Yeah.
combat.
Yeah.
Um, and with no intention or desire to do so, of course, because the more competent I got, the less interested I got in that, right?
Yeah.
And the less fearful I got. And so I started to understand the principle behind the warrior arts, and that it is the warrior, the ultimate aim of the warrior is to avoid violence
Yeah.
and to deconstruct and deconflict, and to, because the warrior understands the outcomes and the ramifications
Yeah.
way better than anybody
There's a
else.
sense of like
Yeah.
people that don't study or that don't understand violence in an intimate way. It's almost like they don't respect the fist. And there's a saying, there's like respect. You have to, if a true warrior respects the fist, he knows the consequences, all the potential consequences of violence. And so
That's right.
he tries to avoid it, or she tries to avoid it.
Right. And the more competent you get, the more compelled you are to also protect others.
Right.
I think, which is a natural outcome of
Right.
long-term period of training if you stick with it. It reminds me also of that kind of metaphor of the sheep and the sheepdogs and the wolves.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is, of
I've been to
course,
Colonel Grossman's seminar before.
yeah, me too. I met him way back when I was at SEAL Team 3 when he was doing a tour for his first book.
Uh-huh.
He's a fascinating guy.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, at a practical level, you know, what were some of you said using language to diffuse? Like, I know when I worked with Strozzi, we talked about the language of violence or aggressive behavior it has a particular kind of energy to it. It's grasping, right? It's coming at you.
Yeah.
It's frontal, right?
Yeah.
Or it's an attack from behind, like a stab in the back. And so Aikido, has moves that are probably not so different than Hapkido in terms of, like, you can diffuse the energy by merging with it. You can blend, you can
Redirect it.
sidestep it or redirect it. You can bypass it by being where the enemy isn't.
Yeah.
And so did you study those types of things to come up with some of your conflict resolution strategies?
I think they probably permeated in some way, but not as directly as they, like, in terms of like sort of the clock principles of redirection and sort of that kind of thing
Right.
in Aikido and Hapkido. Uh, because it's, but there are some crossovers here, because what's interesting is, so when we're talking about conflict, especially like interpersonal or intergroup conflict, what we're typically talking about is not just like, hey, a challenge comes up that's something easy to solve, we'll solve it. Really what we're talking about is sort of protracted conflict, things that are going on
Yeah.
for a while. And
Right.
what's happening in conflict, to me, what's synonymous with conflict is essentially threat. So when we're in conflict, there is some perception that there is a threat to my needs, my
Right.
goals, my values. And so I think there's some crossover with martial arts, is like, how do we diffuse the threat? That is the general philosophy. Now, in a physical situation, how do I diffuse the threat with the fewest amount of people getting injured? I can do
Mm-hmm.
controlled force tactics, that kind of thing. In an interpersonal or dialogue, how do I diffuse the threat? I have to try to figure out what is threatening this person. And we can look at some basic psychological needs that people have. And, people need to feel safe. They need to feel respected. They need to feel like, they're being accepted at an identity level, that sort of thing. So, like, we need to
Mm-hmm.
figure out what's going on for this person, what's threatening them, and then how do I start to change from being the thing that's being perceived as threatening them to something that's being perceived as supporting them? How do I change from a
Mm-hmm.
threat to a support? That's what's going to help calm someone down. People have to know that I'm listening to them, that I hear them, that I care about what they're saying, that I'm considering what they're saying. That kind of thing is like, I'm no longer a threat. I'm on your team. I'm here to help you. How do I support you? Like, how do I change from threat to supporter?
Yeah.
There's some crossover there with martial arts, but maybe it's more indirect.
I think in a workforce it gets really tricky, because you have a lot of shadow elements that are at play,
Yeah, yeah,
and I could see overcompensation from an individual who has, like I talked about in my youth, who is overcompensating for a feeling of incompetence or shame,
yeah,
and projecting overconfidence, which comes out as kind of aggressive arrogance, right? And yet they're completely unaware of it. And frankly, they don't think or realize the effect that they're having on others.
right.
And on the flip side, I could see someone who undercompensates from a lack of confidence and shows up intimidated and victimized by practically everybody in the organization. And we've seen people like that as
Yeah.
well. And so when you put two and two, those two types together, you get, it's like oil and fire. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
kind of
Well,
explosive.
you've got some people with superiority complexes, some people with inferiority
Right.
complexes, some people that are very
That's right.
sort of direct, harsh speakers. They get to the point. They don't really care about how it makes you feel. And then other people who are very passive and they want to, and so those two people communicating with each other are very triggering to each other because one feels like they're being attacked and the other one
Yeah.
feels like they're not being listened to. And so that's a
Right.
tough situation. I mean, the only solution to this kind of thing is for these individuals to recognize that some of the outcomes of their behavior are not getting them what they want. Like they have to
Right.
realize at some point, like something is wrong here. My relationships aren't that
It's
great.
not working.
Yeah,
Right.
something's
Yeah.
not working. So I got to get some help. And then maybe that looks like coaching or therapy or
Yeah.
training or something.
Well, I love this approach you're taking in that, it's one thing for me to go off and to maybe I do a 360 review and I get some feedback that's kind of like, holy crap,
Yeah.
I'm having an impact. And so then I go to therapy or I get a coach and I start working on it. But that doesn't change the fact that I've created conflict and that conflict has a long tail, right,
Yes.
in the organization, right? So I love the approach of actually having a mentor coach, conflict resolution specialist work with a couple, just like a marriage, therapist would work with a
Absolutely.
couple.
Yeah.
And because now you're dealing with the specific issues of the conflict in a particular context or setting,
Yeah.
which is going to impact it, which I might not address if I'm doing kind of my one-off work. And if I'm doing one-off work and the other person is an equal part in the conflict and they're not doing the one-off work, then that also is an incomplete solution.
And it's almost
It's
always the case
complicated.
that both people are having some contribution to the conflict, even though
I would
both of
think
them
so.
think that the other one's the only problem or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, how common is it to have a conflict resolution specialist or coach within an organization? I could see how valuable it is, but it
Yeah.
didn't seem to me like it's a very common thing.
I,
Maybe it's
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 just
becoming more prevalent.
yeah, I think it's a growing industry. I think it's really about
Yeah.
educating people that this is out there. I mean, a lot of companies reach out to us and they say, we didn't know this sort of thing existed. Like, what is workplace
Right.
peace building? What does that mean? And
Right.
so it's really about getting out there and educating companies that this is something that is available, that we do. We have, what you're talking about just now traditionally has been thought of as mediation, but really what
Mm-hmm.
it's called is transformative mediation, and the way we call it our peacemaking program. And that's basically it's kind of like couples counseling mixed with individual coaching in a program. So we have two or three individuals not getting along, for instance, we come in and we do upfront coaching with each person to figure out what's going on, what are some of their communication challenges, what are some of their fears, concerns, goals, et cetera. And then we get them into a room together and we facilitate some dialogue and some problem solving and maybe some healing and reconciliation. And then we do some
Mm-hmm.
coaching on the back end too. So it's a whole program, but it's totally, I mean, I call myself sometimes like a couples counselor for workplaces because
Yeah.
that's kind of
Right.
what it is. And it can be extremely transformative. A lot of times we come in and these people are in conflicts for months or maybe years and they're not talking about it, or they're not talking directly about it, and they're being a little passive aggressive or very passive aggressive and maybe sometimes directly aggressive, and so they just don't have the confidence or the competence to figure out how to get out of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times they have an identity around this conflict. It's almost like, who will I be if I'm not the person being victimized by that other individual? I don't even
Right.
know who
Absolutely.
I'm going to be then, so that takes
Yeah.
a little bit of coaching as well.
For sure. And that's why, like I said earlier, this really is about, emotional development and growth.
Yeah.
And so this is one facilitated mechanism for growth. And it reminds me, some of the work that we're doing is based upon Robert Keegan's deliberately developmental organization concept, where the organization is the primary vehicle or environment for growth,
Mm-hmm.
which is really different than just show up for work and you're a cog in the wheel and a productive asset of an organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really nice to see kind of a movement in this direction. I could see how this also would be particularly valuable for the growing global and interconnected nature of work, whereby you've got to work with other cultures, in a very, oftentimes remotely,
Yeah.
and yet, particularly in the United States, a lot of people haven't developed, what's now being termed cultural intelligence or cultural agility.
Mm-hmm.
And so conflict can arise very quickly when, you might have an American and a Chinese trying to work together in
Yeah,
the same
absolutely.
organization, because they
It's
have just very
it's
different
it's not, yeah,
norms.
it's not easy to change because, like, for instance, we've worked with a couple of companies that have, you know, uh, high level executives or even technical people from, let's say, Russia or the just Eastern Europe, and they have a very
Mm-hmm.
different style of communicating. A lot of them, on average, it seems, anyway, it seems to us that
Mm-hmm.
there's a very different communication style. They're very direct. They're very blunt. It's not emotional. They don't want to talk about feelings. They just want to, like, let's get the job done and go. And then people over here in the West or in America are dealing with that, and they're like, well, I want to feel cared for. I want to feel listened to. There's a relationship here that's important. So there's this difference between, like, a focus on relationship first versus a focus on task first, and the communication styles that follow those, and those often go into conflict. So it takes it's not easy for folks to kind of, like, come to the middle somewhere and go, okay, I'm going to start focusing a little bit more on task and not perceiving when they're direct with me that they're just being rude.
Mm-hmm.
That's just their style and doesn't mean anything by it. And the other side
Mm-hmm.
too, the same thing, like trying to re-perceive how the person's communicating, what that means. It's
Yeah.
not easy, but that's some of the work.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating. A couple questions around that. So I'm thinking about resiliency now. Resiliency is another, thing that is kind of a buzzword these days, as important for both organizations as well as individuals and leaders. And, you could look at that example of that Russian, the oligarchical style of, kind of in your face, let's get this done, stop being so touchy feely.
Yeah.
In one perspective would be, wow, that's a really resilient approach because they're not letting their emotions kind of
Right.
they're not going to be easily hurt, right?
Right.
They've got quote unquote thick skins. But you can also flip that and say, it's actually an organization that is dealing with, emotional awareness, emotional control, and social awareness and social control. Goldstein's, emotional intelligence factors is going to be more resilient over the long term, right? Because you're acknowledging, all the different players and perspectives in the organization,
Yeah.
as opposed to being just one way and my way is the highway.
Yeah. Well, and I
What's your
think I
perspective
guess it's
on
a matter of, like, what does this particular culture or this organization value? Do we value long-term relationships, high retention, high engagement, employee
that?
satisfaction,
Mm-hmm.
employee subjective well-being? Do we value those things? If so, are we measuring them? Are we discovering whether people are, because if everybody's, like, cutthroat, blunt, direct, all that stuff, maybe we don't care whether people are very happy. But if we do care,
Mm-hmm.
we should be measuring it. Okay, are people
Mm-hmm.
happy? Are they satisfied, etc.? If not, then what do we need to change here? So I think,
Mm-hmm.
I guess each organization as its own kind of subculture needs to just decide what their values are and what kind of culture they want to build.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. But there are certain cultural um, aspects that are going to thrive in, this age of acceleration and VUCA over other cultural, kind of
Absolutely.
nuanced
Yeah.
aspects, right? And I think resilience and inclusiveness, certainly, and the ability to take broad perspectives and that cultural intelligence, those certainly seem like they will thrive
Yeah.
over the more rigid types of cultures that, might be more autocratic.
Do you see any? Are you still involved with SEALs at all, or
Well,
military?
in training and mentoring, yes. Formally, no. I retired in 2011, but I was down at the SEAL Command just the other day.
Okay.
So it is interesting to kind of see how their culture is evolving. So
Yeah,
back to you. What's your
I
question?
was just I was curious if their cultures, like, sort of transform. Is there more of an emphasis on, you know, uh, relationships? How people? I mean, obviously, relationships are always a
Yeah,
huge part of being in a team, but I don't know, some of the more of the soft skills or anything like that. Do you
yeah.
see a change there at all?
Well, yes, and also, in spite of what it might look like from the outside, the SEALs and special forces units, because the risk is so high,
Mm-hmm.
and you're willing to lay your life down as a warrior. So you've taken the ultimate kind of like stepped into the ultimate warrior kind of code. There is a lot of emotional awareness and conflict resolution and communication, informal training that goes on, and even formal in the leadership kind of hierarchy of schools that you go through. And so you tend to have highly evolved individuals who deal with their shit right away.
Yeah.
Having said that, there are a bunch of hardcore males, and so that wouldn't work necessarily if it's suddenly you injected 50% females into that organization.
Yeah.
Right? It wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And so I think this is the challenge that the SEALs and other special forces are going through. Is you have this kind of very unique culture that has a high degree of emotional intelligence within the context of a bunch of hardcore men working together in an extremely dangerous job.
Yeah.
And now you have kind of this woke culture stuff being kind of imposed from above because that's institutionally being driven in our culture, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
It'd be fun to have a conversation about that. And you have a drive to open up special ops to women. Now, SEALs haven't had anyone succeed getting through training yet, but we all recognize that it's probably just a matter of time. And so, what's that going to be like, right? So it's kind of a yes, but answer.
Yeah, it's sometimes you see this the idea of inclusivity is very important. It's one of the core aspects that we focus on in a workplace of like creating an inclusive culture, meaning people are included and heard and considered when decisions are being made that are going to affect them, etc. And included on all levels, different perspectives, different histories, different experiences, etc. I think sometimes it almost kind of can go too far in certain areas like this, where it's like, how do we include everybody, even when it doesn't make a whole lot of sense? So I don't know. It's hard.
I think you're right. I think, DEI has, it can swing from like a political spectrum into kind of like, is it good for business spectrum?
Yeah.
I think, is it good for business really depends upon if it's good for your culture and whether over time you're going to see the returns and a beneficial impact to society, right? To culture. How do you measure all that? We still don't know, right? But, it can also be dogmatic, right? From a political perspective. And that's where you get, the counter to that is, extreme pushback against DEI from the opposite political spectrum. And then you get kind of a battle.
Yeah.
And so you see a lot of DEI initiatives, which are on the extreme left, politically driven, being pushed back against, like the critical race theory stuff, being pushed back against because it is being implemented as a carte blanche without real consideration, like an integral approach.
Yeah.
To like, how does this affect the individuals, the teams, the sense of self of the team, the structures, as well as the body of the organization. And I think there needs to be a rebalancing. I'm not against diversity and equity inclusion. I'm one who thinks that actually it makes a lot of sense, but it has to be implemented in a sensible way as well.
Yeah.
And not just as a carte blanche where, where it might cause an organization to stoop to the lowest common denominator, right? Which you would see a degradation of output or capability in the SEAL teams.
Yeah.
Right. If you did kind of a blanket approach like that.
Yeah. Well, and it's like we're not focusing on merit. We're focusing on fulfilling certain sort of social categories, right?
That's right.
Making checkbox. Yeah. There's a large, this is a big topic in leadership training right now, of course. Right. And there's a large, man, it's disappointing to see there's a large opportunity with sort of DEI initiatives, but there's been such a lack of fulfilling that opportunity. And what I mean is just what you said, that in terms of measuring outcomes, measuring how well this is working, et cetera. Like a lot of times for instance, I'm thinking of a certain company that I've consulted with who started a DEI or anti-racist sort of initiative. And the first and the complaint to me from the CEO was, nobody seems engaged with this. It's not really doing anything. Like I'm trying to get people like interested, but we're not. And especially the people that are, in our minority groups, they're not even speaking up during our like training and this. And I said, well, why did you start this? Did you do some sort of measurement or understanding as to like there was a problem and then you wanted to do this to address the problem. So that's my first question. What was the problem? And number two, why did you think the approach you're taking now was the solution to that problem? Like, what did you base that choice on? And there's no answer to this. She's like, we didn't measure. I don't really know if there's a problem. And I just thought this is what we're supposed to do. And this is like,
and then that was the knee jerk reaction after the the Floyd summer,
right?
And rightfully so. Everyone had to take a look at that, and so the response was just implement a DEI initiative now.
Yeah. It's just to check a box. It's not meaningful,
I love that idea of kind of the intersection of meritocracy and inclusiveness.
Yeah.
Because that's tricky, but it's doable,
Yeah.
But everyone has to be bought into the meritocracy aspect who's in the organization. That's why it doesn't really work in bureaucratic organizations. It has to, it can work and should work in most profit organizations, but not all for-profit organizations are meritocracy either. You know what I mean? I don't look at Amazon fulfillment centers necessarily as a meritocracy.
Right.
I mean, they may be. I've never worked there. Pretty interesting discussion. The other thing that's really came up for me is, communication training, and I think this could fall into the distinction of horizontal development versus vertical development. Horizontal development is like, I'm going to go get new skills, and vertical development is I'm going to work on myself to become a better person. Well, in the old days, like I've been to crucial conversation training, and it was a 2-day workshop, and I learned the model for how to, come to, how to use language in an approach to resolve a conflict. And also, I think it's Marshall Goldsmith's nonviolent communication training.
Yep.
But, just learning the different nuances between passive and passive aggressive and, complacent type of communication, and trying to see where I fall on the spectrum and improving my own skills doesn't necessarily change who I am, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't get rid of the shadows and the, those elements that we talked about earlier, which show up as aggressive or complacent or a victim. What's your take on that? And do you bring communication training into your work at all like that? Or is it just part and parcel of the coaching?
Yeah. I mean, we do a lot of training. Communication training is, conflict resolution. The core of it is communication. So how do we communicate in conflict to get back to places of peace? We certainly use elements that NVC, nonviolent communication, has used, like, assertion, 3-part, 4-part assertion messages, that kind of thing. Right. I think that, there's some, I listened to the episode a few, maybe last week or something, about, we were talking, I can't remember her name, but you were talking about vertical versus horizontal
Bina.
training. Yeah. And she kind of mentioned, like, that's also a binary, right? Where that's also an up. And I thought about that, and I think that's right. I think that when you do learn horizontal skills, there is a potential to also go vertical with it. So, like, as you learn skills, you're starting to develop things internally, and you're becoming aware of things. And I also think that there's an opportunity to really deliberately do vertical training of, like, doing more, deeper coaching work or psychotherapy or that kind of thing,
right?
Figuring things out with yourself. So I think it's super important, all of it.
They can work together in a synergistic fashion. Right?
I think
you don't do vertical development at the exclusion of horizontal.
Yeah. I mean, I think they have to almost go together. It's like, if you only do one or the other, you're not getting the full spectrum of it. If you're interested in being a really effective leader or effective workplace culture advocate, you kind of have to do both, in my opinion.
Right. You wrote a book, Conflict Resolution Playbook.
Yeah.
What's the model? I mean, every good book like that has kind of a core model. What's the model?
Yeah. Well, so that was meant to be a really practical skills book. So I present, like, a number of different scenarios, real life scenarios that I've dealt with. I give a little story about the scenario, and then I kind of give what they did right, what they did wrong, and here are some practical tips if you ever get into this yourself. And they're kind of general things that I see a lot. Thematically, I see a lot of these types of conflicts, either at work or personal, et cetera. So I tried to give a clear outline of, step by step, here's what you could do in this kind of situation, or here's what you could think about, and some action steps to do. So it was very sort of practical based.
But do you have a general, or can you describe a general kind of process for diffusing conflict, or peace building, as you call it?
There's a number of different models depending on the situation. But what I'll say is, whenever we're talking about conflict resolution, I generally think of it in conflict resolution as being in 2 buckets. And the first bucket has to come before the second. The first bucket is always care, and the second bucket is solution. And you could think about this in different contexts. You could think care when we talk about, debate. If we want to have a good conversation rather than just a pure argument, we have to first listen, and then we can state our position. We have to first show that we care about the others, we hear the other, we're considering the other before we get into position, defense, it's all that sort of thing. Otherwise, we just go straight into defense mode. So in terms of just a general framework, anytime that someone is in conflict, if they're interested in getting out of conflict, sometimes people aren't interested in that. Sometimes they just want to kind of intimidate or be aggressive or whatever, or avoid it. But if they actually want to resolve the conflict, the first thing is always has to be care. How do I care for this individual? How do I listen to them, hear them, make them feel like I actually respect what they're saying? And then I can get into trying to solve it or state my position or why I think that my position is the better way to go and that sort of thing.
So listening, perspective taking, framing, respecting the other individual.
Yeah.
It seems like the care bucket would be the most important because no solution will flow without that.
Correct. Right? That's why I say it's always has to come one before two. If we jump straight to now, sometimes they're like really easy little solutions. Okay, we can, but if they're deeper, they're protracted, they're interpersonal, they're relational, almost, always we have to go for care. Sometimes it just takes care. Sometimes it just takes listening. Sometimes people just want to be listened to, want to feel heard. And then as soon as they feel heard, their defenses come down, they can breathe a little bit, and they're way more able to have a conversation about a solution. But until they feel heard, until they feel respected or at least like recognized, they're not going to be in a place to have a solution.
Yeah, right. I've been involved in legal disputes that were mediated successfully, and the role of the mediator was crucial. Is that the same? Do you find that the same in kind of business conflict, where the role of you as a mediator or an interlocutor, to help bring perspective and to frame things better?
Yeah, crucial? Absolutely. I mean, the number one, because people get stuck in these conflicts, they don't know how to get themselves out. They don't even know what they're doing right or wrong, or they don't know what the other person's doing wrong. They just think this person is attacking me and I'm the victim. And that's what both of them typically think. And so we have to get them out of that mode. But yeah, the mediator's role is in our work, it's kind of beyond mediation into coaching. So every mediator is also a coach in our framework because we do coaching and dialogue facilitation. And it's crucial, number one, because it creates a sense of there's a sort of independent, neutral, external person that's coming in to create a space where both of you can finally like just say what's on your mind without feeling like you're going to be attacked or retaliated against or something. Someone's actually holding the space to do this in, who's a professional, who's confident, who knows what they're doing. So that is cathartic in itself, just being able to talk to someone and even to each other in a feeling where, hey, it's safe to do this. I'm not going to be retaliated against if I just say what's going on for me. And the other part is, if a mediator can help reframe, like you said, a mediator hears something from one of the parties and says, okay, let's reframe that because the way that was said was not super productive or constructive. Let's reframe it in this way. Is this what that sounds like? Is this what you mean by that? And that sort of interpretation can start help get the dialogue really, really moving and moving towards a more of an optimistic end.
That's fascinating. At the beginning of this, I wanted to draw the distinction between conflict resolution and peace building.
Yeah.
It seems to me they're qualitatively different, even though they're linked.
Yeah.
Here's what I think. I look at conflict resolution as kind of a one-off. I got a conflict, I want to resolve it, and I'm going to move on. But peace building is more of a sustained, long-term, both individual developmental as well as cultural developmental.
Yeah.
It seems like
you hit the nail on the head. I mean, peace building really is I would say that it's synonymous essentially with conflict transformation. And the difference between conflict resolution and conflict transformation is exactly what you said. Conflict resolution is about being able to solve an acute problem, whereas conflict transformation recognizes that there are presenting problems that could be resolved, but really there's a larger system-wide structural or cultural situation that's allowing these types of conflicts to emerge. So peace building or conflict transformation is how do we both address the acute conflicts and start addressing over the long term are structural elements that are allowing these types of conflicts to emerge, and how do we start changing the cultural context to be more peace oriented as opposed to conflict oriented.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I
Yeah.
mean, peace is it's a high vibratory, energy state,
Yeah.
right? If you want to look at it from a more metaphysical sense.
Yeah.
And so it's not something that, if someone's lived in violence or is thinking it has a negative thought process, it's very difficult to get them to that level quickly, right? It could take a long time.
Yeah, well, like I said, I think people form conflict identities. They form identities around being victims, around being in conflict. I know lots
Or
of
being in control,
being
right?
in
And this is
control. Yeah,
oftentimes
if
the
I'm no
same.
longer in control, if I'm no longer in conflict, if I'm no longer a victim of this person or this group, it leaves a large gap in sort of the way I look at my self concept, the way I look at myself, the way I identify, and I have to fill that with something. And that could be a painful process, figuring out how do I fulfill that with something else. But when someone actually does, and they say, you know what, I don't want to be in this anymore. I don't want to be a victim anymore. I don't want to be a conflict anymore. I want a different identity, a different dynamic in my life. And they replace it. It's so empowering. It's just life changing. But they have to
Yeah.
make that decision at some point.
We need this type of work to be done at a cultural level. And I don't know
Yeah.
how you transition out of a specific organization to a cultural level, because I think one of the challenges that I see with kind of the justice warriors is they're good intention, but they lead with aggressive,
Yeah.
conflictual tactics, which just hardens the stance of their opponents.
Correct.
And then creates more conflict.
Correct. I mean, the crazy thing is if you take a couple of people and you take them out of their groups, because groupthink is very powerful. When people are in groups, they tend to get more aggressive and emotional. When you take them out of those situations and you sit them down, let's say an individual on the far left, an individual on the far right, and you start asking them questions about their underlying core values, core needs, beliefs, etc., they have a lot of the same shared values. Like we both want our families to be safe. We both want to thrive. We both want to feel free. We both don't want to feel controlled. Everybody's kind of got similar values, and then they just have these different positions based on the media they watch, the communities they're involved in, that kind of stuff. The positions or the methods by which we're going to achieve those things, and those are where the conflicts happen. But if we could just get them out of those groups and we sit them down and go, wait a minute, we actually have a lot of shared goals and values here. We just need to figure out better ways of doing them that everyone feels taken care of, rather than like this one side's going to feel taken care of and the other side's going to be just completely, screwed. So to me, it has to happen on a very local individual level, even maybe smaller local level. It's so hard to do it on a massive level. The news is just too powerful. The media is too powerful in terms of their biases. And
the media doesn't want peace building.
No. They want conflict because that's how they make money.
It doesn't sell. It doesn't make money. I noticed on your bio and your website, PollackPeacebuilding.com, that you're a blacksmith, or maybe that's a hobby. What is that like?
Yeah, I trained in blacksmithing. I haven't actually done it in a while. It's really tough. You have to do it a lot. You have to keep up with it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Right?
And I made, with my instructor, I made some amazing looking knives just from from just pure steel, just high carbon steel. And it's so cool to like transform those things, but it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of equipment.
It's not like you have a setup in your garage, where you go out and fire up the.
I would love to. I would love to have that eventually.
The fire pit or whatever.
But the problem is too, is like it's so messy. It's so messy.
Is it?
Oh yeah, and there's just stuff there's bits of metal and dust and everything everywhere. So you kind of have to have a separate studio to do. You can't even live near it, I think, in my opinion.
I've always been fascinated by what type of people would go like live in, Williamsburg, Virginia, and take on the role of kind of like the ancient blacksmiths and go do that every single day.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. There's some guys, like professional blacksmiths. That's what they teach. They work privately for people, custom commission stuff. And it's cool. I mean, they're into it and they're good. And
that type of like master craftsmanship is a dying art. And I think it's cool that they're keeping it alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that could be akin to a martial art. You know what I mean? Just the kind of, using the wax on, wax off and integration of physical, mental, almost a spiritual quality to it. I imagine. I've never been a blacksmith or done it, but anything where you're doing, like making a sword back in the Japanese, samurai days, like that was like a spiritual practice, just like a Zen
Absolutely.
ceremony.
Yeah.
And thousands of layers go onto these swords.
And it's taught only through lineages from master
Right.
to mentee
Your
or something. Yeah.
apprentice. And, right. That's fascinating. So what's next for you? We're going to wrap this up here, but what are you working on, and kind of what's exciting in your future?
Yeah. So, I mean, I run my company, Pollack Peacebuilding, which was a conflict intervention, conflict management training firm. We just launched, the thing I'm really excited about is we just launched our Peaceful Leaders Academy. It's a sort of a sub company.
Nice.
And that
Mm-hmm.
is a super flexible hybrid model of both training and coaching that helps leaders develop into what we call peaceful leaders. So we've developed this model of leadership called peaceful leadership, and we're doing some academic work to prove the model. And we just started a nonprofit called Peaceful Leadership Institute, and
Nice.
we're doing is research and education around this model of peaceful leadership, which talks about these three core pillars of sociocultural elements that need to be established in an organization to really create a sense of peace and productivity in the organization, and then 5 competencies surrounding those 3 pillars. And so we're training leaders in that, and we're also training teams in some of the basic elements
Mm-hmm.
of peaceful leadership. So that's something I'm really excited about, is a peaceful
That
leadership
is
academy.
exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be fun to follow up on. One of the outcomes that we seek to develop in our leadership program is compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And compassion and peace aren't identical, but they do have some similarities, right? So I
Yeah,
think
absolutely.
people
Well,
who've cultivated compassion, both for themselves and others, tend to lead with the hand and not the fist. Tend to be more
yeah,
peaceful.
yeah.
And it has
Compassion
to
is
do with
huge. I mean, especially having compassion for people you're in conflict with. I mean, it's really difficult.
right.
You know.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So where can folks find more? I mentioned your website, Pollack, Pollack, peacebuilding.com. And do you have a separate domain or something for the Peaceful Leader Academy, or is
Yeah,
that on your
it's
website?
peacefulleadersacademy.com. Yeah,
Peacefulleadersacademy.com.
yeah.
Awesome. All right. Uh, Good stuff. Thank you for doing the work you're doing. It's really important, and I'm completely in alignment with it. Obviously, we need more. We need more peace and compassion in the world. Right now, it sure looks like kind of a violent and conflictual place. At least
Yeah,
from the, if you listen to the news media, which I try not to,
yeah.
but
Me too.
still in your face.
Me too. Well, yeah. Thanks for having me on. I as much as I can, I love talking about peace and conflict and trying to help people figure out how to get to a place of peace.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Jeremy. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.